Good morning, everybody. Let me open this up with prayer here. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time. And again, Father, thank you for this church and for these folks and for how much they love you, Father, and love each other. Father, I ask that you speak through me today, that you get me out of the way and make sure that the words that are spoken are the words you want. We love you, Father, and I ask in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Y'all, today's sermon is, it's an interesting one. And I know that by saying that, I imply that all the others are not. That's the logic guy in me. But let me tell you a little bit about how this one came about. There's a guy named Amir Tsarfati. He is a Messianic Jew in Israel. He's also a member of the Israeli military. And I've been following him since earlier this year. And I heard a sermon that he did called The Last Generation. And it really intrigued me. And I started talking to Tim about it. And I said, you know, Tim, if he's right, if Tsarfati is right, it's really an astonishing thing to think about. It's not to be taken lightly. And the more I thought about it, the more a sermon started coming to me that I'd like to call the fig tree, the parable of the fig tree. So what I want to do today is tell you what he preached just in synopsis. I'm not going to repeat his sermon. You can go listen to it yourself, and I would recommend that you do. But I'm going to tell you what he said, and then I'm going to talk about what it means if he's right. If Tsarfati is right, what does it mean for us? Because I think it means a lot. Basically, he was preaching on the idea that the end times have begun. That's a lot to say. Now, certainly I am not an end times preacher. Don't ever get me confused with that. I'm not as biblical scholarly enough to even think I could do that. And part of me thinks it's a waste of time anyway. I think Tsarfati is an end times preacher. So this is not a sermon about is it going to happen? Is it happening now? Let me see, there's 7 trumpets, and has each trumpet happened? And there's 184. All of the numbers that come from Daniel, come from Revelation. The sermon is not trying to figure out if we are in those times, which a lot of end time sermons are. This is not like that. And neither was Tsarfati's. Basically, what Tsarfati said was that the key feature of this time is the return of the Jews to Israel, the reestablishment of the state of Israel. And he refers back to Matthew 24, 32, 35. In fact, his sermon is based entirely on this one set. I'm going to read it because I didn't trust myself to memorize it. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. You all know that verse. I know you do. What Tsarfati is saying is that Jesus was saying that when the fig tree comes back to life, that's the last generation. That's what his whole speech is about. Now, so this sermon is basically, I'm going to ask you to consider that if Jesus meant that the fig tree parable is about the return of the Jews to Israel, and that was the initiation, that was the beginning of the end of days, that Jesus meant the creation of Israel was the kicker. That's huge. That's huge. So either Jesus meant that or he didn't mean it. But if he meant it, then it means that we are in the end times. And that's profound. That's a profound statement. Because Tsarfati also said that Jesus said, this generation will not pass until these things have been completed. Well, a generation, according to Tsarfati, also went through Let me see here, Numbers 32, Psalm 95, Hebrews 3, which defines the wilderness generation as 80 years. And Tsarfati says that basically a generation in scriptural terms is basically 80 years. That means 80 years from the inception of the state of Israel is the generation of the end times. I'm not telling you that I can prove that that is true. I'm asking you to consider it. Consider that that is what Jesus meant in Matthew when he was talking about the fig tree. Because if it is, that's an astonishing thing. And then what do we do in response to that? Let's assume for this morning that it is true. That the establishment of Israel is the initiation of the end times. The rest of what happens during the end times, we don't have a clue when it's going to be, and we're not going to. Anybody that stands in front of you and says, I know when the rapture is going to occur, for example, is a liar. Because Jesus said even he doesn't know the day. So why try? Why try to figure it out? It doesn't do anything for you to try to figure out when the rapture is. The piece of information we need is, are we the last generation? That's what Tsarfati was preaching about. I want to talk a little bit about how incredible, and this was not in Tsarfati's speech, but he does allude to it from time to time. I've heard him talk about it in other situations, other speeches. Think for a minute how unlikely it was that Israel would have been reestablished. I tend to take for granted that Israel was recreated as Israel and the Jews were invited back to it. But there is nothing in history, arguably, that was more likely to happen, unlikely to happen than that. Remember that the Jews were scattered so far all over the world, they didn't even speak Hebrew anymore. They lost their land, they lost their language, they lost their identity. They were scattered all over everywhere. And when I was listening to this and thinking about it, I thought, what if, and think about this, what if tomorrow there was a big piece of news that came out that the U.S. government had decided to take the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, half of the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, a big old chunk of Georgia, and change the government of that area and give it back to the Cherokee people. That's what it would be like. It would be that big of an event. Except for the Israelis, it was even more unlikely. Because they weren't together anywhere. And they didn't even speak their own language. Now, the other thing that I think that I misunderstood, or that I didn't think about with the creation of Israel, the return of the Jews to Israel, is that it happened in response to the Holocaust. That the world felt so guilty, they decided, well, we better do something for these folks since 6 million of them were killed. Not true. The Zionist movement started in 1883. It became a political organization in 1897, before the First World War, let alone the Second World War. So it occurs to me, and I'd like to suggest that you consider for yourself whether it occurs to you, there is no possible way that Israel could have been reconstituted and the Jews could have been invited back except for the act of God. The reconstitution of Israel as a state is the clearest example of an act of God I can think of. On a huge scale. So totally unlikely. And then Jesus says the fig tree and the state of Israel are the same thing. At least that's what Tsarfati is saying. Tsarfati also said that there are 3 plants that Israel is referred to: the fig tree, the vine, the grape, and then the olive tree. So he gives a whole bunch of examples of how trees are used to refer to Israel in some way. So let's assume for the moment that God said when Israel is reconstituted, when Israel returns, and when it blooms. And I'm here to tell you, if you look at pictures of Israel today and Palestine 70 years ago, 80 years ago, there's no resemblance. I've seen pictures of Palestine before World War II. There's nothing there. Nothing. And it really is blooming. The vine has reconstituted. So if we are in the end times, if the end times have started, here's the big thing. What do we do? How do we behave in response to that? You know, we all know the verses where Jesus, the parable of the people waiting for the wedding ceremony, and the big question is, trim your lamps, make sure your lamps are trimmed. Do y'all remember that? So the question is, are your lamps trimmed? Do you have oil for your lamps? Are you ready? We don't know when the rapture is going to happen. We're not even going to guess. It's a waste of time. The question really is, are we ready? Are we ready? How do we get ready? That's what I want the sermon to be about. How do we make sure we're ready? And what I did was I leaned on Matthew 22:37. And that's where Jesus is asked about the law. And he says, love God with everything you've got. Love God with your heart, your soul, your strength. We've all heard about 3 different versions of it. But basically Jesus is saying, love God with everything you've got. Love others as yourself. And that's really captures the whole of the law. So I want to take it in 3 steps. This is what the sermon is about. To trim your lamps, ask yourself, how are you doing on those 3 counts? How am I loving? How am I in my love for God? How am I in my love with others, for others? And how am I doing when it comes with regard to my love for myself? Where am I in those 3? What state am I in those 3 things? As far as the love of God, how do we love God? Jesus said, those who love me obey me. We know that. So we can show our love for God by obeying him. But is obeying God and loving God the same thing? I don't think it is. I think we obey God because we love him. But you can obey someone simply because you're afraid of him. And fear is not necessarily love. So what is loving God? And I'm going to toss something out there for y'all to consider. I think that loving God is considering who he is to take a moment and just consider who he is. It's easy to love God. I believe it's easy to love God when we know that he loves us. That he loves us so, like Mondell just said a little while ago. He loves us so much in spite of ourselves. He loved me when I hated him. Some of y'all know my story. We'll get to it here in a second, a little bit of it. There was a time when I hated God. I was not indifferent to him. I was not an agnostic. I believed in him because I needed to. I needed him to hate. And he loved me in spite of that. And I can't forget that. There's no way that I can ever get away from that. So one, I think it's easy to love God when I consider who he is and how much he loves me and all of us, how patient, how kind. So I think part of loving God is to just consider who he is. And Scripture tells us all about who he is. The other thing I think is part of loving God is trusting him. And I want to say a little bit about this. I could do a whole sermon on trust, but I have to be careful when I think that I'm trusting God to make sure that I'm not trusting that he's going to do something I want him to do. I tend to think that trusting God is trusting that I'm going to get the outcome that I want because I trust God will make it happen for me. And that's not the same. I wouldn't recommend it. I think the way that we trust God is to trust that he loves us. And if we really know that he loves us, it doesn't matter how things work out. It won't matter. Because his love for us trumps everything. However it's going to work out, if it's consistent with his will, it'll be loving. So it seems to me that we can love God by one, reminding ourselves of who he is, and then trusting that he loves us. The second thing, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, is loving others. Where are we at in loving others? I ain't doing so good. When I heard the sermon, Tsarfati, about the same time, I I found another instance of where the media was telling lies. I thought, gosh, I've heard it said that we are living in a blizzard of lies, or living in the empire of lies, and everybody's lying. I thought, why are people lying? Why is there so much deceit? Why is there so much dishonesty from everywhere? I'm not blaming any one group. And I asked myself, I was sitting in the chair considering who lies when they know they're lying, everybody else knows they're lying, and they know that everybody else knows they're lying. I mean, who keeps doing it? And I thought the answer came to my mind, addicts. People who are addicted to stuff lie. And I can tell you that because I have been an addict. Y'all know my history, so it makes sense. And then that led me to think that the people that we need to love today, if we're in the end times, Scripture says that people will be lovers of themselves. They will be lovers of money. They will be lovers of all these things. We are told none of this should be a surprise to us. It's all in Scripture. But how do we love them? And here's what I'd like to send out there for you guys to consider. If we think that their behavior is based in the fact that they believe that money will get them something and power will get them something, what will it get them? Money will either get them power or power will get them money. But what do those two things get them? It gives them a sense of importance, a sense of relevance, a sense of control. Those are all things cocaine does for you. I mean, when you look at it, those are all the same things. So it's possible, I believe, this is going to sound kind of, if I'm sounding crazy, I'm okay with it. But it's a little bit easier for me to think of loving them if I can have compassion for them. And it's not compassion like, well, they're just wrong. I'm angry with them because they're wrong. It's easier for me to say, no, they're addicted to something because they believe that what they want, what they're getting, what they're devoted their life to is going to give them something, just like a cocaine addict or an alcoholic or somebody else, and they're mistaken. There's no truth in it. So if you were to walk down the street and you were to see a heroin addict sitting up against a building, you would have compassion on that person because you know that what they're addicted to is killing them. Well, I submit that these people, if you consider them as addicts, what they're addicted to is killing them too. It's killing them spiritually. It's killing them because they're placing their faith in their power, their faith in their money, instead of their faith in Jesus Christ. So in a very real way, we could possibly consider to have compassion on them, because what they're doing is going to hurt them. It is hurting them. And I want to do something here. I'm going to try to shorten this up because it's kind of a long sermon, but I want to suggest an idea that I call illogical kindness. A lot of folks that y'all know and I know always talk about how they would really like for some family member to come to Christ. That's something that they really would love to see. And the question is, how do you witness to them? Well, I want to suggest what I call illogical kindness. And that's where you do an act of kindness for someone that makes no sense, that doesn't have an explanation. I'll give you a real brief story. I have a sister that, for some reason, has never liked me. And we've had a lot of conflicts over the years. For one period of time, 4 years, she wouldn't speak to me, and I never found out why. She asked me at one time to babysit her house. So I said, okay, and while she was gone, I planted her herb garden. She had the herb garden marked up, she didn't have anything in it. So I spent a whole day planting all kinds of herbs and everything for no reason. And I knew that when she would come back, she would say, why did you do that? And the answer is, you guess. You guess why I did that. Because you love them. And if you're working with someone who doesn't know Jesus, If they know that you know Jesus, they're not going to have that conversation. They're going to say, why did they do that? Well, yeah, they're a Christian. It's all about love. And your illogical kindness becomes the witness. It becomes the communication that you can't have verbally. And I'm here to tell you that if you've got a damaged relationship in the family, as we all do, or will sooner or later, if you have a damaged relationship within a family, it's tougher because they're going to say, well, you did that because you're supposed to. You're my relative. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If you've got a damaged relationship with someone, that's the only thing you can do, is show them some illogical kindness. Because they may not accept anything else. Your words aren't going to matter. Okay, let's get to the last one, and that's love yourself. So we've got love God, love others, love yourself. That's how you take a temperature where you're at, how you're doing. The last Wednesday night we were talking, and I said, I hate to admit it, but I'm 65 years old. I'm just now figuring out how to do some things. And one of them is this notion of living one day at a time. It's so easy to say, it's so hard to do. It comes straight from Matthew, sufficient to the day, the evil thereof.